Makat Bechorot, we talk about, it's a very interesting thing. In Makat Bechorot, we talk about the death of the firstborn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hang on. We talk about the death of the firstborn. And in that context, we hear a very odd thing, which we don't really think about so much, which is Lechol bnei Yisrael lo yecheratz kelev leshono lem'ish ve'ad isha leman yid'u ki ani Hashem hamafle ben Mitzrayim uben Yisrael. Okay, good. We're close enough. So we hear that the reason that no dog shall snarl or literally stick its tongue out at the children of Israel is in order that everybody know that God is the one who differentiates between Egypt and between Israel, which not quite clear what that means, right? Like, what is that? What exactly does that prove, right? So what I'm trying to do now is to take us into the Egyptian galleries. We're almost there. Here we are. That's Ramses on his chariot. And to show us something that's relevant to that. Okay. So we know that the Egyptians were obsessed with mummies, obsessed with the afterlife. There's so much to see here about the Egyptian afterlife. So we're looking at mummies, and that's really the context. Here are some mummies that have been opened up with these little wooden miniature models of Egyptian daily life, which I think is worth mentioning in a moment. In terms of chametz and matzah, you can actually see a mummy. Here's people mourning. This is a painting that's showing us, based on an Egyptian papyrus, the mourning over the deceased, right? It's really neat. There's images of the priests preparing the body. They would soak it immerse it in salt, nature's salt, to dry up the fluids. They'd put the organs in these canopic jars, meaning like canopy, like they're closed. They would put the main organs, and then they would put them back in the body. And here's an actual mummy. Look at the blackened, dry skin.
Oh my God.
Today, we don't open them up because you can scan them with an MRI without damaging them. But this is the way they used to do things in the olden days. And in the next room, we're going to see some papyri, which talk about what happens according to Egyptian belief when they go into the afterlife. And that's what I want to talk about. Hang on. There it is.
And I think another contrast that gets overlooked is that Judaism is the anti-death cult, where Moshe is telling people to choose life, and he connects death to evil. So it's like the opposite.
Say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could say that. You could definitely say that. These papyri are all different variations of what's called the Book of the Dead. Now, the Book of the Dead is a very ancient Egyptian text, which is basically, I like to call it the Mesilat Yesharim, the path of the just for the afterlife. In other words, once you die, here is your dying for dummies, right? What to do in the afterlife? How did they figure this out? I don't know. But apparently, after death, you need to go through a series of tests, examinations, ceremonies, and appease all of these different gods and goddesses and demons, and remember everybody's name, or else they'll be offended and it's all over, right? So all the hard work is in the afterlife, pretty much. And the pinnacle of this Book of the Dead, the guide, is what's called the Judgment of Osiris. Now, remember that Osiris is the god who gets killed by his brother Set and sent into the underworld, and he eventually is brought back to life as a dead man. So he's the ruler of the underworld. So here he is, embalmed. He's wrapped up, and he's green. If you remember from Beetlejuice, everybody's dead and they're kind of green and wrinkled, right? He's dead. He's green, and he's overlooking. There's a whole ceremony here, but the centerpiece is this scale. Okay, there's a scale in which the god of the god who's responsible for the transition from life to death, as opposed to death itself, is Anubis, who's a jackal, a wild dog, and that's going to tie into Makat Bechorot. And he's weighing the person's heart against the feather of justice. Right now, we can unpack this. There's so much to talk about in terms of the feather of justice, but I do want to talk specifically about Anubis. According to Egyptian mythology, the force of nature, which has to do with the transition from life to death, makes itself present in this world by dogs, wild dogs. We're not talking about, little French papillons or poodles. We're talking about jackals, wild dogs, which are on the outskirts of civilization, and they howl when there's death. So these are dogs, and the god of death is Anubis, of the transition from life to death. The priests who would embalm the body would wear a mask looking like a jackal. They kind of represented this in Stargate, if you're familiar, right? They wear this mask of a jackal. That's Anubis, to sort of have that power to help him transition into the afterlife. How does that tie into Makat Bechorot? We're starting to see a picture here. The god of death is related to dogs. What you would expect as an Egyptian is if there's death in every household, en bait asher en shamet, that you would hear dogs howling and barking, right? That's the natural thing to expect. That's what dogs would do. And yet, all you hear is crickets. And people suddenly realize, like, I guess Anubis doesn't have control over life and death, right? And that's a beautiful thing. That's why is it that l'chol bnei Yisrael echatz kelev l'shono? The reason is, leman tedu asher yafleh Hashem ben Mitzrayim uben Israel. It's that God differentiates between life and death, Egypt and Israel. And I heard this from Dr. El Ziegler. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece.
Wow, it's amazing, because this is another, like you said, there's an intimate knowledge of what's going on in Egypt. It had to be somebody who was aware of these things. It couldn't have been written thousands of years later. This is obviously whoever, obviously the author of the Torah knows exactly what's going on in Egypt. So this is really cool. But I actually do want to talk about, if you don't mind, when we're done with this segment, to discuss the feather of justice, because I've heard the connection between that and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and that whole thing. So if you can maybe touch on that.
Perfect. Well, first of all, this is the picture, but I actually have a slide prepared so that I can show that specifically. Let me just find the exact slide. Here we go. So we're looking, actually, that's the picture from the British Museum. I just enlarged it here. It's from that gallery. So here is, in the center of the picture, we have Anubis, the jackal, who's managing a scale. And on the one side of the scale is a crouched figure with an ostrich's feather on its head. And on the other side is a jar with the human's heart. So obviously this is weighing of the heart. And we're not weighing the heart against pounds or kilograms. We're weighing it against the concept of justice manifest by the goddess of justice, whose name is Ma'at or Me'at. But here's the key. According to Egyptian belief, the role of Pharaoh in the universe, because Egypt is the universe basically, right, is to maintain Ma'at, is to be responsible to cosmic order and balance. And the beautiful thing is how they represented cosmic order and balance by balancing a huge feather, the ostrich feather, on its tip. That's the symbol for order and balance, and harmony. So that's the role of the Pharaoh. Pharaoh, in his own mind, and he's been indoctrinated for hundreds of years. The pharaohs believe that their role in the world is to maintain Ma'at. And so his day was strictly regimented by priests. He has to do all these ceremonies and rites, and he has to bathe in the Nile in the morning to bless the Nile, and he does this and he does that. Like, he's basically the high priest. And at a certain point, the pharaoh can't visit every temple in Egypt, so he has the priests representing him, right? But the point is that the pharaoh plays a very important role in the functioning of Egypt. Okay, so let's take it to the next step. So when Moshe comes to Pharaoh and he tries telling him, you are in the wrong for subjugating these people, this is a moral battle. Like, you think you're going to convince Pharaoh by coming with heavy artillery to let our people go? Like, what's the point of that? So you're going to say, okay, so your God's also an arbitrary bully. I mean, who are you to challenge me, the maintainer of Ma'at, of cosmic order and balance? And besides, like, do you know the damage you're going to be doing to the Egyptian economy and the glory of Egypt and the gods that have been appointed and all that stuff? It's like, this is a battle of will. It takes a lot to get Pharaoh to realize that as this happens only at the end of Barad, where he says, "Chatati apam, Hashem atzadik v'ani v'ami harashaim." Like, I'm in the wrong. God is just, and me and my people are wicked. I mean, wow, that's progress, right? Applause. Except then he goes ahead and makes a mockery of himself, right? But it's a process. So in this process, God tells Moshe, behind the scenes, like he doesn't say this to Pharaoh, but he says, "V'ani achbid et lev Paro, ani achbadet li et libo, kaved lev Paro." He also says, "Chizakti et libo," right? And he akshet lev Paro, I'll harden, I'll strengthen, I'll heavy. But one of the expressions that are used, which is very much in tune with the Egyptian understanding of justice, is, "I have made his heart heavy." Why does a heavy heart play a role? Because in Egyptian mythology, having a heavy heart means you're doomed. You're condemned to death in the afterworld because you are wicked against the balance of cosmic order, right? So that is a very powerful expression, which Moshe, having grown up in the palace, would be very familiar with.
Amazing. Unbelievable. So, and is there anything else regarding Egypt that you want to show us, or?
I think so. I think a beautiful thing to do, I think that would be a nice way to kind of end, would be to talk about making about chametz and matzah, right? And that has to do with daily life in ancient Egypt. If you're in New York, I recommend visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met, and there's the tomb. It's known as the tomb of Meketre. It's 12th dynasty. So we're talking about way early on. We're talking about let's say the time of Abraham or earlier. And in this tomb that was discovered by accident, we found all these miniature models of daily life. The Egyptians would make these tiny wooden painted models to represent what the deceased would do when he was alive, to magically allow him to keep on doing it in death. So we know a lot about the Egyptian daily life. Now, what we're seeing here is representations of the estate of a wealthy Egyptian named Meketre, Re being the name Ra, Re, Meketre. And one of the things we see here is a granary. And this connects us, first of all, to the story of Yosef. So if you're seeing the screen, I quoted the verse from Genesis 49, Vayitzbo Yosef bar kechol hayam harbe me'od, ad ki hada lispo ki en mispar. Joseph collected grain so much, like the vastness of the sea, like the sand of the ocean. He couldn't even count it anymore. He's storing it in granaries. The fact that Egyptians stored grain in granaries, okay, I understand, that's a normal thing to do. But what's interesting in this model is that you're seeing scribes sitting in the granary, which is kind of an odd thing to do. I mean, you'd think in the granary, you have people collecting grain. What are scribes doing there, right? But scribes are basically keeping track of the grain for tax purposes, for measuring the wealth of the estate based on how much grain you collected.
Wow.
But Egypt was the provider of bread in the ancient world. I mean, when it gets to the Roman period, the Romans actually really squeezed everything they could out of Egypt. I mean, you couldn't even go to Egypt without a visa. Egypt was really taken advantage of by the Romans, who looked at Egypt as Herodotus called it, the gift of the Nile. It's the bread basket of the ancient Near East. It's where you produce bread in Egypt. So they just heavily taxed the Egyptians, squeezed the life out of it. It was a very awful time for the Egyptians. But Egypt is the surplus of the Nile, provides so much grain and in abundance, and they don't depend on rain, right? So that's why whenever there's a famine in Canaan, which depends on rain, you go to Egypt, which does not depend on rain. It has the Nile. It's pretty consistent. Most of the time it's consistent, and you can rely on Egypt for bread. So this is step one, is you see that the Egyptian economy was heavily reliant upon and measured by grain. Grain was their GDP. That's the G in GDP. It's like their grain, right? And so this is no joke. They measured the wealth of the estate based on grain. Grain was basically edible currency. So let's take it to the next level. What do they do with the grain? They prepare bread and beer, the staple foods of the ancient world.
This is incredible. But what are these fig trees are how old?
Close to 4,000 years old.
Oh my God.
It's incredible. They lasted because they were in the dry temperature of Egypt, buried underground, intended to never be found.
Oh my gosh. Are they painted over, or did they have the paint on?
This is the original paint.
Wow.
Amazing, right? People think these are like Playmobil characters made to mimic. Like, no, these were made in Egypt.
Wow. And what's amazing is that like you have accountants 4,000 years ago. Just it's so cool.
Yeah. The Egyptians also had mathematics and astronomy, geometry. I mean, you can't build the pyramids without advanced geometry.
Sure.
Right. So here's Egyptians, and what you're looking at, this is from one of these little rooms. You just isolated the different images, different processes of making bread. So let's look from left to right, and then we'll talk about the title, which is Lo Yachel Chametz, don't eat chametz, leavened bread. We have women who are leaning over grindstones, and they are grinding grain, right? And this is something you do every single day. We have an expression, the daily grind. Right, this is something you would, in the ancient times, you would make fresh bread every day. It's not, you don't store it over time, right? So you grind, you make bread. There's a servant here who's sitting here, and he's kneading the dough, and they actually made the flour on his hands. You see his hands are white. He's kneading dough. And then there's a man all the way on the right who's sitting in front of the oven. Now, what we don't take into account is a very astounding fact, and that is that Egypt invented bread.
Really?
Let that sink in. Or should I say let that rise, right? Let that sink in. The Egyptians invented bread. We don't know exactly when, but we know that they invented bread. And the way that was made possible is because the Egyptians are a settled society. They're not traveling anywhere. So in order to make bread, you have to have an oven, which needs to be heated up to very high temperatures, which already means you're not nomadic. It's not practical for nomads. Nomadic, you make matzah, you make pita. It's easy to make. All you need is something to heat up the ground a little bit. You mix flour and water, you make basic dough, you put it on the ground, cover it with the ashes, it's heated from the top and the bottom, and boom, you're done, right? It's easy to travel, you're mobile. The Egyptians weren't a mobile society. They were a society that settled around the Nile. Now, here's the beautiful thing. The two staple foods of Egypt, which were actually a greeting, which meant like good health, bread and beer. That was a greeting in ancient Egypt, is the staple food of Egypt. Egyptians were ridiculed by many people. They called them those bread eaters, like made fun of them, yeah? Bread and beer basically represent the essence of what's wrong with Egypt in terms of the Torah, because Egypt is Beit Avadim, it's a house of slavery. And this is just one small detail in a bigger picture that shows you that the geography of Egypt, the fact that they live on the Nile, creates a slave mentality, a mentality of dependency on the Nile, on the Pharaoh, on that structure that you're completely locked into. And that is expressed in their staple food, which is the one food we're supposed to stay away from on the holiday where we celebrate freedom and mobility, right? We can move, we can choose, we can go places. It's incredible. Like, we're commanded to eat matzah, and people miss this detail sometimes. Why is it that we eat matzah, right? What's the standard answer? Why do we eat unleavened bread?
Because we didn't have time.
Right, but we were commanded to do it before we were kicked out.
Right.
It's like a game of historic Jeopardy, right? Like, first of all, make it that way. Now it's gonna, like, what came first? But that's the point. When we become masters of our own destiny, it's not defined by our subjugators, by the pharaohs, right? So we basically say, listen, we are going to go back to our nomadic roots where we are free to move and free to go. We're mobile, right? And that's part of what happens in the desert. We need to learn to depend on God and not on the Nile, right? To be where there's a relationship between our free choice and how successful we are in the world, which is what Israel is about. Like, Moshe actually tells us before we go into Israel that the primary difference between Israel and Egypt is that Egypt has the Nile and Israel has rain. You cannot rely on the Nile. You have to rely on rain. And to rely on rain, you have to act morally, which is what the Shema is all about, right? The covenant of Israel is when you act appropriately, the land will respond. It's up to your free choice. It's not a given. Egypt is a giver. So it creates a dependency. To free ourselves from that, we need to act in a way of free people, eat the food of free people, right? Like lechem oni, which also means the bread of poor people, but poor people have nothing to lose, right? As opposed to people who have too much invested, so they're entrenched, right? So here's people who are making beer as well. The gentleman on the left is making, I suppose it's bapir, which is a kind of like a solid form of like a porridge or something that's used to add to the beer and then to create beer, to let it ferment. So tashbitu seor mi batechem, chametz and seor, bread and leaven, anything fermented that represents Egypt, we need to get rid of that when we celebrate our freedom. It's an incredible concept. And this is one of the things we see in Egypt where there's a sensitivity. So to the land of Egypt and what it represents, even in the food that they eat. And so I think there's a funny metaphor. Some people, I don't know if people follow, Iron Man, but it's amazing to think that came out in 2008, I think it was, right? Iron Man came out, and so Tony Stark is captured by some terrorist group, and he's finally able to escape, and he comes to America. He's in a car, he's being driven to a press conference, and the first thing that he says he wants is an American cheeseburger. I want America food. It's like there's food that represents America. So this is Egypt is represented by bread, which is such an amazing concept. Like freedom, it's all about the food you eat.
Wow. Fascinating. Unbelievable. And this is the last slide.
There's more, but we're kind of running out.
I do want to end with one thing actually that ties us all together. It's something I read from a book called No Other Gods by Kenneth Seeskin, Professor Kenneth Seeskin, who was actually the second guest on our show. And it ties everything in. It's very interesting. He says, rather than describing the choice between monotheism and idolatry philosophically, the Torah represents it geographically. Pharaoh's Egypt is not only the house of bondage, but the paradigm of a pagan culture, rich, autocratic, polytheistic, and heavily dependent on magic. By contrast, the Promised Land is a place where free men and women can worship a God who abhors magic, superstition, and extremes of social inequality. Unfortunately, the choice between them is not as simple as it appears. From the moment the people are rescued at the Red Sea, they express the desire to return to Egypt and revert to being slaves. And he basically goes on to explain that Judaism is really a religion of contrasts, that it's everything that it's doing is a polemic against the culture that surrounds it. So I find this very fascinating. And really, this was amazing. Thank you so much for making this happen. And I'm sure everybody loves, graphs and visuals. So whoever's listening to the audio, please tune into the video because you would really enjoy. Thank you so much, and
pleasure.
Hope to do this again one day.
Hopefully, I'm looking forward. We can, maybe we can talk later, pencil in. Maybe we can do something for Lag BaOmer. Maybe
that would be great. Amazing. Thank you so much.
All right, wonderful. And hopefully, if you're hearing this in time for Pesach, Chag Sameach, everyone, would be a holiday of freedom.
Chag Sameach. Amen. Chag Sameach.